So when we look at evolution overall as a process, there really are pieces or individual processes within that overarching concept of evolution that allow evolution to happen. The mutations are there. We'll talk a little bit about those today. Natural selection and adaptation we'll get to. And then we can also, within this context of microevolution, talk about things like genetic drift and gene flow and sexual selection and how those end up changing and altering those allele frequencies from one generation to the next based on how organisms are able to reproduce and pass on that genetic information. So let's talk mutations, right? So genetic mutations are a way for populations to get new diversity introduced because what I'm doing is changing the actual DNA structure. Something happens to those A's, T's, C's, and G's that causes them to change, and as a result, the phenotype changes, right? So something happens in the DNA structure, that's your genotype, that then causes a change in the phenotype, the physical expression of that information. We can also get added variety by sexual reproduction by just mixing up different characteristics. So that's putting your two capital A's together or putting a capital A with a lowercase. All right, and so do I end up homozygous dominant or heterozygous or homozygous recessive? And that's because of sexual reproduction. So there's a couple of pieces to understand when we talk about mutations. First and foremost, this is really the only way that we can get brand new variation into a population. But it's really not a common thing to happen. So there are a lot of structures and a lot of proofreading processes that happen when we go to make new DNA, to make a new cell, that sort of stop mutations from occurring. Now, they're not perfect, right? Mutations happen, they get through. The other thing here is that in order for that mutation to matter evolutionarily, I have to be able to pass that mutation on to my offspring. Now, most of the organisms that we talk about, us, a cat, a dog, a chicken, these guys are all sexually reproducing organisms. They're also multicellular organisms. So in order for a sexually reproducing multicellular organism to have a mutation that's going to matter from an evolutionary standpoint, that mutation has to occur in cells that will ultimately create those sex cells, those eggs and sperm. All right, this is why something like skin cancer, which is a result of a mutation that happens in your skin cells, all right, causes skin cancer, but you're not going to necessarily pass that skin cancer on to your offspring because it's occurring in skin cells, not your sex cells. So the only way that these mutations end up being functional from an evolutionary standpoint is if that mutation ends up in a sex cell. But once that happens once, so long as that offspring survives to make their own children, they will then forevermore pass that sex cell, or pass that mutation, onto their offspring, because once that single sex cell gets passed on to the next generation, that offspring's body is made from that single cell, which means now every cell in that offspring's body has that mutation. Okay, so when they go to make their sex cells, they will naturally have that mutation in their sex cells as well and continue to pass it on. And that's why things like breast cancer or any cancer that's known to have a family history, it's an inherited cancer, is because somewhere along the way that mutation that's associated with that cancer happened in a sex cell. That offspring now was born with that mutation. It's now pervasive throughout their entire body. They go to make their sex cells, the mutation's already there, and they'll continue to pass it on. Okay. So mutations in general, regardless of where they happen, they're heritable changes that are changing the DNA code itself. So here, if I take a look, here's a normal gene, right? Okay, it happens to code for this cysteine amino acid, so building blocks for proteins, right? I get this particular mutation, and what happened is I changed a cysteine, all right, or a G, to an A. Now, rather than coding for a cysteine amino acid, I now have a tyrosine, and that then leads to changes in the way that protein is produced, which is what we physically see as something different. Okay, so long as that mutation happened in a sex cell, this will now continue to become something that natural selection can work on. So mutations are important because what they do allow evolution to do is increase the genetic diversity. So here's my gene pool, right? Okay, this is what my population has to pull from as they're making the next generation. Mutations allow me to increase the diversity that already exists. I get to add new traits. I get to add new variation for a particular characteristic. Now, those mutations, although they're changes in DNA, and if I can pass them on because they've happened in sex cells, evolution can work on it. So if I look at a mutation, I really have sort of three options as to what that mutation will ultimately do to the function of that organism who now has it. All right. So a mutation may be a favorable change. It may be an adaptation and actually improve a species' ability to exist in its environment, in which case, if I'm looking at allele frequencies from one generation to the next, if this mutation allows that species to survive and reproduce better than the current variation in the population, then we should expect this mutation to actually become more common. It should be selected for, in which case these guys should survive and reproduce more often, and over successive generations, this should become the common trait. That's one option, if that mutation helps them survive better than what's already currently existing in the population. Option number 2 is what most kids associate mutations with, and those are unfavorable changes, something that doesn't improve their ability to exist and in fact may actually be harmful. So if I look at our cute little turtles here, all right, you see all these normal colorations for turtles. The coloration is presumably there to help them blend in, camouflage, and I've got these poor little albinos guys here who have this mutation that now allows them to stick out better. These guys are now going to be subjected to stronger natural selection in the sense that nature's probably going to weed this out. All right, this isn't beneficial to them. They're more able to be seen by their predators, and so these guys are going to get eaten, get killed off, and even if they do maybe pass on the trait to 1 or 2 offspring, they're probably not leaving the number of offspring behind that the rest of these guys are, and so that trait should disappear relatively quickly. Okay, or at least the frequency should drop. There's also a third option. So rather than it being favorable and increasing the population, it's not unfavorable, and so it's not decreasing. I get situations where I have a change in the genetic information that doesn't help the species, but it doesn't harm it either. All right. And so it might be something as simple as being sort of this white versus cream rose. Well, they're kind of similar, maybe not identical. The sequence may not be identical, but it doesn't help them, it doesn't hurt them. All right, and so if that's the case, this frequency for this allele really is going to change at random because natural selection isn't going to work on something that isn't beneficial. It's also not going to work on something if it's not harmful. And so these traits can kind of bounce around. Maybe they'll disappear. Maybe they'll become more common. We kind of just don't know, other than just to kind of watch it and study it. So there's really no way to predict what will happen here.